Exploring the bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
Wow, Tim, look at all those strange glowing orbs all around us. This is really weird, and they're moving closer. Do you think they're intelligent?
Maybe. They were swaying to our opening theme music. Oh, whoa, watch out! They're getting closer. Gosh, you could almost reach out and touch them.
Yikes! This is too close for comfort. Oh my God! Maybe we can get to the safety in the basement of the White House.
Not sure if that's such a good idea. There could be a bunch of them or something else down there as well.
Well, maybe one of our guests tonight can tell us how to evade these orbs, because we're going to find out if they're dangerous or not, and what the meaning of all these mysterious lights could possibly be. And that, in addition to Nikola Tesla and Otis T. Carr and some other really hot buttonhole topics, right, Tim?
Oh yes, that's right. Yeah, weird science. That's something that I'm always interested in. Just kind of out of the mainstream, so to speak. But science that used to be considered out of the mainstream is now accepted. So who knows in a few years' time as to what kind of wonderful things will be really an everyday part of our life.
Well, you are our weird science man. There is no doubt about that. You were recently involved in a History Channel mini-series called The Tesla Files. And I have right here in front of me one of the many books that you've done. Of course, you're best known for the Lost Journals of Nikola Tesla, but this other book is really fascinating because it goes beyond Tesla. It's Men of Mystery, Nikola Tesla and Otis T. Carr, Weird Inventions of the Strangest Men Who Ever Lived. And that's going to be one of our topics tonight. But without further ado, why don't you tell our listeners who we have hovering just outside here in our KCOR digital radio studios.
It'll be my pleasure, Tim. Well, tonight we have got some really fantastic guests. We have Ralph and Marcia Ring. Now, Ralph Ring had an ongoing interest and participation in areas of esoteric and ether knowledge and technologies. So after leaving the U.S. Army in 1954, he began an ongoing search for answers to many questions concerning the unknown. He worked for a U.S. government-funded research facility in the areas of magnetics, levitation, and teleportation, and his search eventually led him to the realities and participation of teleportation and esoteric consciousness. Now, Ralph is a natural scientist and a creative technician who, in the early 1960s, worked together with Otis T. Carr, who was a prodigy of Nikola Tesla, and a team of dedicated scientists on alternative technologies, one of which was teleportation. He was one of three to pilot the man-made spaceship, the OTC X-1. His dream since birth has been to produce levitating homes, cities, and countries. He and his spiritual partner and wife, Marcia, talk on expanding consciousness and natural law, which enables people to see the simplicities of all things there by bringing their dreams closer to reality. Now, Marcia, who's also with us tonight, is an ordained minister and worked for Bendix Field Engineering Incorporated in the 1970s, a deep space tracking station where she experienced the tracking of unknown objects, and experienced JPL laboratories, knowing that there was life in the multiverse. Not just sure how to communicate with them. So together, Ralph and Marcia share their experiences of their great life, sharing with the audiences that we are much more than we realize. We are one that we have been searching for. Now, with us as well is Wilbur Allen. Now, Wilbur is engineer inventor and is no stranger to UFO encounters. He had an alien encounter at the age of 5, which left him face to face with a group of gray ETs. We'll definitely have to talk about that one. He's a former White House Air Force One engineer for ABC News and a contract photographer at National Geographic. Now, Allen has forensically documented sightings and anomalies, discussed NASA's confirmation of the existence of hidden portals in the Earth's magnetic field. He related these portals to wormholes and believes that they are the means that ET craft travel into our world and between dimensions. The wormholes are associated with the Earth's north and south poles, and Admiral Byrd was likely seeing ET craft traveling out of the South Pole wormhole during his expedition, Allen says. Now, these wormholes could lead into another universe or dimension and may account for unusual disappearances and anomalies such as in the Bermuda Triangle. Now, Allen says that all the reports associated with UFOs, for example, objects that show up on radar and then mysteriously disappear, that they're entering and exiting through portals associated with these wormholes. Now, Allen's books include a close encounter of the third kind at the U.S. Capitol, Close Encounter of the Third Kind, Baltimore, Maryland, and A Close Encounter of the Third Kind, the Washington Monument. So I want to welcome Wilbur and Ralph and Marcia Ring. Thank you very much for being with us tonight on Exploring the Bizarre.
Thanks for having me.
Well,
Thank you.
I wanted to start out by asking Wilbur a couple of questions. Wilbur, last time I hooked up with you, we don't know each other very well, but you were speaking in Trenton, New Jersey, at the Pat Marcatilio's event that he has once or twice a year. And you had the late astronaut Edgar Mitchell on the phone. Isn't that correct?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, on Skype. I think it was, or on the phone or whatever, because I remember he was there, like in the audience with us. Well, I'm wondering where to begin on this, because there's so much to cover, but let's go back a few years. Now, you say you had an encounter when you were 5 years old. Where was that, and what are the circumstances behind that?
I was 5 years old, and I was at a U.S. military base in the United Kingdom called Sculthorpe, which was a RAF USAF joint venture SAC base. And my parents worked with nuclear weapons. And I believe that the extraterrestrials that came and visited my family initially came and visited my parents because of their involvement with nuclear weapons. And that because I'm an offspring of my parents, and my parents were interracial, that they were interested in my genetic background. And they indeed came into my room and implanted me when I was 5 years old on this base. And
now, okay, so you have a recollection of this taking place. Can you describe what they look like?
When I it's not a recollection. I was completely awake when they came into my room. Yes. I was basically in my bed playing with my toys, which most little kids do when their parents put them to bed. And I'm messing around with my little G.I. Joe, and all of a sudden the door to my room opens. And I don't see my father walk in, which is a tall individual. I see these small, childlike bipeds, which were grays, what we would call grays. I'd never seen an extraterrestrial at all in any point in my life when I was a kid.
Yeah, and of course this would have been before Willie Schreiber's communion book or any anything really on the subject. And I don't even think the in the science fiction movie. Well, what year would have this taken place? About
1961.
Okay, so yeah, this was well, that was even that was, I guess, basically around the time of Betty and Barney Hill, but not
It was
maybe when the
exactly
story
during the time
originally
of Betty
came
and
out.
Barney
Yeah,
Hill.
yeah, yeah. Okay,
Yes.
all right. Okay, so here they come marching. How many of them were there?
There were about 5 or 6 of them, but it's interesting you mentioned Benny and Barney Hill because Betty Hill took photographs of the objects that were in her presence while she was being visited by extraterrestrials, and the photographs that she took were consistent with the anomalies I encountered at the U.S. Capitol building July 16, 2002. But to go even further with this, the aliens that the Hills described were exactly as the aliens were when they came into my room as a child. What was more abstract, though, is what they put into me. They put something into me that caused my body to go into rejection mode. So for 7 years on a nightly basis, I vomited, and I'd vomited, and the doctors couldn't understand why I was vomiting, and they couldn't find any reason why I was vomiting. And I was vomiting on a nightly basis. The doctors were giving me medications to stop the vomiting, which the vomiting did not stop at all. So it continued for about 7 years, and after 7 years, when the vomiting stopped, objects started coming out of the sky and landing in front of me, and it forced me to start carrying cameras.
Okay, now what did your parents say? Did you obviously you would have told your parents something if you were vomiting every night?
My parents had the same encounter that night. That's what was interesting about it. My father and mother were adamant about not talking about it. And my father was military intelligence. And back in those days, it was Cold War era. When they had secrets, whatever secrets my parents had, they went to the grave with them. That's how secretive my mother and father are. And with that in mind, and my father was also a Vietnam veteran, which Agent Orange took his life. In Vietnam, he documented green spheres over the tarmac at Cam Ranh Bay, which was documented during the day. And it just so happens at the U.S. Capitol building, as I was having a close encounter with whatever these objects were, it was a formation of green spheres. And they were landing in the rear of the reflection pool. They were landing in Taft Park. They landed on a roof of the U.S. Capitol building. There was other areas in which U.S. Capitol police officers reported objects, anomalous objects in their reports, in which landed that night that I had my close encounter. So I had other individuals who made professional reports associated to the event that I experienced at the U.S. Capitol building. But it got even further because the green objects that I documented were also documented by the crew of Apollo 7, Apollo 11, Dr. Mitchell on the lunar surface, the crew of Apollo 16, and the crew of Apollo 17. So we have physical documentation in space of these green objects. But mine was the first, however, on Earth, and mine was directly in front of me. So I would say, just based on the documentation itself, mine was probably the best documentation of the green fireballs, even compared to what NASA has on file right now. Mm-hmm. So with that in mind, I had to go to Edgar Mitchell and talk about these events, and Edgar Mitchell basically confirmed the data.
Now, how did you hook up with him originally? Because I would imagine at the peak of his interest in UFOs and all, he was, of course, he was even retired from the astronaut program, but fairly busy. I mean, he must have been very impressed by what you had to say in order to take the amount of time that he did to work with you on this.
He was more than impressed, but what was the selling point to all of it was the data that I gathered in Sedona, Arizona, while filming Uncovering Aliens for the Discovery Network. And in Sedona, I set up my camera, and these objects materialized. When I say materialized, there was no possibility for an object to fly into the airspace. On the film, it showed it incrementally materialized into the airspace, so I've videoed that. The very same event was documented on the lunar surface during Apollo 14 on Dr. Mitchell's EVA-1. And during EVA-1, Dr. Mitchell just happened to notice an object which we shall describe, let's say, as about 3 aircraft carriers in length, materialized in the space in front of him on the lunar surface for about 5 or 6 seconds and dematerialized. It essentially was the same kind of craft that I was documenting in Area 51 in Sedona, Arizona, in the North Pole when I filmed with the A&E and the History Channel for Missing in Alaska. All of the objects that I was able to document on Earth had been documented on the lunar surface by the crews of Apollo astronauts.
Well, definitely, there's a lot of strange things going on in Sedona. I've had a number of synchronicities down there, which just kind of boggle the mind, and I found that the synchronicities play a key part in the UFO phenomena. But okay, so you after your first contact, did you have anything after that? I mean, you were 5 years old. What was your next?
As a child, they constantly, keep in mind, my parents were military, so my father did his 25 years in a extended tour in Vietnam, which was 8 years. So in the duration of his military career, I stayed on military bases, and all the military bases that I lived on, these extraterrestrials would appear in my room on every base.
Well, now, do you
They
think that?
me.
Yeah, do you think that anybody in authority knew that this was going on, and did they try to what's the word I'm looking for here, track your activities? I mean, the people in the military, did they try to keep tabs on you?
Well, the military is an interesting organization. My father, being military intelligence and having contacts within the military community, had ways of making things disappear. One of the things they never talked about, and on military bases especially, and I noticed this when I was a child, because in first grade, I started telling the kids in my class that I'd made contact with aliens, and the teachers didn't like that. And in the course of their action to separate me from the other individuals in the school system, they put me in the school for special ed students. So from first grade to seventh grade, I was in special ed, only because I started talking about extraterrestrials to my classmates in school. So you can't talk about aliens on a military base to military kids, yes, because those military kids are going to go back and tell their parents, and their parents are going to go back, and all the information that you hear is going to go, it spreads within the community. So they tried to keep everything hush, and they did keep everything hush. My father worked in military intelligence, and he did things, for example, in Vietnam, they investigated a crash, the B-52, which they found in the jungle. It was placed there. It didn't crash. It was placed there. Can you imagine an aircraft being placed in the jungle with the crew intact and mutilated? And that's what they saw, and that's what they found, a fully intact B-52 with a crew intact, strapped in their seats, which was even more bizarre is the insects and the bugs and the people around there, the natives and the Viet Cong, did not go near it.
Well, now, you say mutilated. Well, obviously, you're giving us an indication that the intelligence behind. Well, okay. So, who are these Greys doing that?
Well, they didn't know. They never really got into it because it was interesting. My father and his associates their sons and daughters were classmates of mine.
Uh-huh.
And when you hear classmates saying things about what their parents did, and you heard your parents say the exact same thing, then you knew that what they were into was not something anybody else would want to get into. And all of my friends talked about this event, and in the case, what they experienced in Vietnam in the jungle on this B-52 with the crew intact, when they came back to the base, they spent 2-3 days getting drunk. Hardcore, drinking tequila. They were like getting smashed.
I could imagine why. Now, we did a book just recently, been out about a couple of weeks now, UFO hostilities, and we had a few cases in there, some from Vietnam, and there was an incident that supposedly took place near the White Sand Proving Grounds, where there was a sergeant that was mutilated. Well, what's the purpose of these mutilations?
Well, I'm thinking more along the line of spare parts. And, when the eyes and the genitals and crucial organs were removed, and that in the removal of those crucial organs, no blood was spilled, then they knew immediately that there was a level of intelligence there in terms of medical science and surgery that was more advanced than anything anybody had ever seen before, because everybody was mutilated and there wasn't a drop of blood in that aircraft.
So you think that these beings, I mean, do you have a name for them, or you just call them the Greys, or?
Well, it's hard to say because I know the ones that encountered me as a child have been monitoring me for as long as I can remember, have not been hostile to me. In fact, they've been giving me indicators as to when and where to photograph these objects that I photograph now on a nightly basis. So I know that there's that communications associated to whatever is piloting those crafts is indeed in contact with me at a telepathic level. And I understand that. I understood that when I was a child, when they implanted me, because I could hear their thoughts and they could hear my thoughts, but they didn't move their mouths and I could hear them.
And what have they indicated to you their reason for coming here is?
No indications at all. It's absolutely abstract. In fact, what I believe is that they've basically groomed me to document their entry and exiting our airspace. And that's basically what I'm doing. I'm documenting these objects entering these airspaces and exiting the airspaces, and not through conventional means. I'm talking spatial portals, which you mentioned earlier during the opening of the show. And NASA confirmed that, but what NASA is not telling people, and which is a great error in NASA's research, was they basically associated those portals to the Bermuda and Alaska triangles, where in reality, those portals can be associated anywhere. I documented a portal in Area 51, Nevada. I documented a portal in Sedona, Arizona. I documented a portal in Shreveport, Arizona. I documented a portal in the North Pole. So wait a minute, I'm getting the same objects in all of the locations I do research, then it must indicate that those spatial anomalies, which NASA says are only in the Alaska and the Bermuda triangles, are also associated to any area of interest that these extraterrestrials have established.
So you're talking about them coming through like wormholes or stargates?
It's wormholes. It's a network. It's like if you understand the theories behind the 4G network, like the Verizon 4G network, which I'm not selling Verizon, but I'm going to use that as an example. Yeah. They have these networks where all of the phones within the network all operate autonomously and under the same rule, under the same governance. And that means, okay, I can call somebody in Colorado in real time and talk to them in real time, even though I'm on the East Coast. Now imagine on a much grander scale, a portal which allows you to do transports from one area to another at a blink of an eye, like a Stargate per se. And you have those portals established in areas of interest, meaning Washington, D.C., like a couple blocks from the White House where I was getting it in D.C., or near the Capitol building where I was getting them above the roof of the Capitol building, the dome itself. So we have the locations generalized based on the activity that's documented within the regions that we do our research in. So understanding that when I do research in airspace, for example,
right.
Area
Wilbur,
51.
Unfortunately, I'm going to have to interrupt you here because we have to go to our bottom of the hour break. When we come back, we'll bring Ralph and Marcia Ring into the conversation. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.
Now back to exploring the bizarre with two of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal, your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
All right, welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre. I'm Tim Swartz, and we're going to bring Ralph and Marcia Ring into the studios now. And I should note that, several years ago, as Tim Beckley mentioned, I had written a book called Men of Mystery, which dealt with Nikola Tesla and Otis T. Carr. Unfortunately, when I wrote this book, I had not heard about Ralph Ring at the time, which is unfortunate because he would have added so much more to this book. I think, Tim, that maybe we should reissue this book sometime and add a few extra chapters that have Ralph's commentary on what actually happened with Otis and his flying saucer. But Ralph, Marcia, I'm so happy to have you in on Exploring the Bizarre tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Likewise.
All right, so Ralph, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your background? Now, Will in the first part of the show was talking about some of his, early encounters. Now, when you were younger, did you have any, unusual experiences that kind of put you on this path that you're still on today?
Yeah, I had quite a few experiences. I was where I live now is Paradise, California, and I was raised up here. And my sister and I used to walk 7 miles to school round trip every day, and we got well acquainted with the animals, the birds, the beetles, everything when we were in our travels back and forth. And we found that in nature, everything is quite simple. It isn't complicated. And you can communicate on many levels with nature if you let go of the idea you have to talk. So we learned many things of how the natural laws work. And when you eliminate fear in our journey, we were having all kinds of experiences with wild animals and everything. We were feeding deer out of our hands and everything. It was nothing. It seemed perfectly natural, and to us it was. And that didn't change until I went out in the exterior world, if you will, and I went out and discovered everything seemed to be going backwards. It was counterproductive. They weren't. I was shocked to see, that where's the technology here? There's nothing that hasn't been going on for a long period of time that's any different. And I saw a lot of misconceptions in the technology and a lot of misuse of the technology. And a lot of people were listening and accepting things that were very difficult to understand that I had, because of my experience, found very, very simple. So I decided, well, what am I going to do with my life here? This is different, totally different. And I decided, well, I've got to find a way to share with people the simplicity and the beauty, absolute beauty of nature in the perception that I had when I was a kid growing up. And I had to share that because life is quite simple and quite beautiful. And to this day, it's never changed. I've never seen anything that was that was not on purposely happening to enlighten people about who and what they are and the way they perceive life. So that was my younger years, and I decided to go ahead. I didn't know what to do. When you're working with nature, you don't work with thought.
Right.
You work with feeling. So I had to wait for some kind of guidance to show me the way of, well, how do I get this across to people? And I went through some very different and bizarre experiences that were all simple in nature, but quite different, in order to find a way that was suitable to enlighten people, to wake people up, if you will, to who they really are, living a authentic life and not knowing it, thinking and living in a synthetic life, which our thoughts engage in, and it's an exterior life that we create instantaneously. The internal life, the authentic life, is quite different. You don't have to have a dictionary or an encyclopedia to understand who you are and what you are and why you're here. So, that being said, you got another question?
Well, just listening to you, I mean, you sound so much like what I have read about Tesla, Nikola Tesla, and the things that he wrote about, and a lot of his ideas as well. Now, when you were going to school and then to college and places like that, I mean, were you taught anything about Tesla? Because I know when I was in school, uh, Tesla, I mean, I did not hear about Tesla until years later. He was not taught anywhere in any of my classes. Anything having to do, with electricity or whatever, it was all Edison, 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 Edison. Nothing about Tesla. I mean, what about you? I mean, was the experience similar to yourself?
Yes, it was. I knew very little. I did cross paths with information from time to time, and I became interested in what he was doing that was quite simple in nature. And one of those things was building a circular foil craft that could levitate and teleport. They that's not hasn't been publicly put into a lot of the literature, but I did find out that was going on in the late 1800s and early 18 and 19, right?
Mm.
So
well, let me ask you this: how did you hook up with Otis T. Carr? I remember as a youth listening to him several times on the Long John Nebel radio, show late at night, talking about his OTC craft. And in fact, somewhere here, I think I have the original plans for his starship. He was based out of Baltimore, Maryland area. How did did he reach out to you, or how did the two of you kind of get onto the same page?
Well, long story short, to get in a lot of pertinent information here, I I had worked at one time in Costa Mesa, California, in a government-funded research and development laboratory called Advanced Kinetics, and I got hired on with little or no credentials. I was just me. And but I knew about magnetism, and Dr. Weinhardt, he was the director of the institute. That hooked him into inviting me to become a member of their team, which was investigation of the bizarre nature of things and how they worked. And one of them was magnetics. So I got hired on to my job was simple. I had a giant oscilloscope and a giant, they called it the, Polaroid camera. And all I had to do was sit there all day long and try to fire electrons through a magnetic field without deflection, without it going positive or negative. And I worked there for a long time, and I was getting bored because they're using force. And so I decided, I've got to approach this so that they know there's a simpler way here, and we can advance the technology. You don't have to try to force anything in nature. It's all simply happening if you relax and accumulate the energy instead of trying to force the energy. So I did several things, but the one that was most pertinent was I went home and tore apart a big computer I got at a garage sale, took the cathode ray gun out, and set up a magnetic field underneath, and like I had learned in nature, and I mentioned that you can communicate, I started talking to the electron in my feelings. Like, I know it sounds a little bizarre, but I think I'm on the right program to say that.
It is. It isn't exploring the bizarre. You go right ahead.
Okay. So I started talking to electron in my fashion, and said, "Now we've got to find out what's going on here." And it says, what I was doing at work by using force was suffocating the electron in a sense, in a metaphor that people can understand, because it was not allowed to breathe. Everything in life has to breathe. I mean, it sounds bizarre. Stones breathe, trees breathe, everything breathes. And we've been only in the technology that I've seen trying to force things to work, as I was doing at Advanced Kinetics. So the electron said, let me breathe. And I said, okay, I'm going to fire you through here and give you a millisecond or two and see what happens. Well, the first time I did, which was, I don't remember, I think a couple of milliseconds, pulse beat, and the electron went into a vortexual motion, spiraling actually right through and over the magnetic fields without any deflection, because it was pulsing itself through breathing instead of being forced to one side or the other. So I'll jump ahead now a little bit so I can get some more information in here. So I wrote this up, took pictures of it, and took it into Dr. Weinhardt. And I said, I think I found a simpler way. Now, I'm only a lab tech, but I think I found, you turn these over to the engineer, that's what I'm talking about here. We can advance our ways of doing things around here. So he took a look at it and saw what I was doing and said, hey, Ralph, I see where you're at. But you're in woo-woo land here, because you don't understand. This is a government-funded research and development lab, and we're paid to look for answers, not find them. And that statement blew me out of the water. I couldn't believe it. Changed my whole life when I heard that.
That doesn't surprise me.
Well, you're not interested. He said, no, I'm going to have to thread this. Tell you to go back to work. I'll give you a few more bucks in your envelope, but we can't go there. It's not in this dimension. So I went back to work for another week or two, and I remember crying when I left the job. I just walked off. I said, I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore. And on my way home, I happened to meet one of my neighbors that had been going to these meetings called Understanding. This was located in Costa Mesa, California. And
Dan Fry.
Yes, Dan Fry.
Yeah, Daniel Fry was the creator of it. Mm-hmm. And he said, what's going on? I told him the story, and I said, they're not interested in this kind of technology or the simplicity of life. He said, well, come on over to our meeting. We got a lot of people that want to listen to you, and you can do the same about the unusual and bizarre things that they're into. Mm-hmm. So the next time the meeting came up, I was invited, and I went there and told them my story. And I said, well, they asked me, what is your intention? I said, well, I'd like to wake people up a little bit and tell tales of simplicity back to authenticity, so that they can realize who they really are. Life is perception. Life isn't what we think it is. It isn't a material life per se. It's just perceived as such. But it is really our perception that changes things. So I said, what I want to do, I would like to build things, and based on what I'd learned about Tesla's technology, I'd like to build spaceships that levitate, that travel between dimensions and portals and so forth, and have the floating homes with everything on board. You can have farms, you can have water, you can have everything that you need right on board. Floating cities, floating countries. I mean, where do you stop? I remember at one time I was in Washington State, and I went to Northwest and heard Buck Fuller, and I got a few minutes to talk to him, and he said, people don't understand. They're living in a giant state of illusion, and that until they realize we are in and on a giant spaceship by comparison to the technology they're using. They're locked into an idea that's seems to be real that is far from the fullness of reality. So anyway, they said, well, wait a minute. There just happens to be a guy named Otis Carr that's in Baltimore, Maryland, and he was demonstrating. He put in a patent for a spaceship, and the patent office said, "Wait a minute, you got levitation, you got teleportation here. No, you can't. You got to take those out. We can't give you a patent on that. They don't exist in our physics." and he said, "Well, they exist in ours, and we have prototypes to prove it." And they said, no, we'll take those out. We'll give you a patent on an amusement device, and you can set it up in parks and let kids ride on it and stuff. And we'll have another Disneyland. Well, that wasn't the word, but we'll have another amusement park going. And so that really discouraged Carr. And he realized he wasn't going to get very far. So he said, well, okay, I'll put all this information and write a book called Dimensions of Mystery. It's still available. It's in the Library of Congress. And in that, he wrote prose and poems about how simple life works. The sunlight flashing through a dragonfly's wings at 2 o'clock in the afternoon was a very simple formula that would open a portal and change your perception of what you're looking at. You would see things that the rest of the world couldn't see using your simple imagination, which I got scolded for out here all my life. And those
So
things.
did you actually go to Baltimore and work with Otis T and his laboratory there?
No. They came to us. He was running into trouble. They thought he was a fraud. They thought he was.
Oh yeah. He had some stock problem selling stock or something. I think. Yeah.
So the Understanding Group, I said, God, that'd be great to work with somebody like that. And they said, well, let's call him. And so they did, and they told the same story I'm telling you. And he was fascinated. He said, oh, that's somebody I can talk with. And Understanding funded the whole him and his entourage back out to California or to California, and decided to have us meet. And they put us up at Lake Arrowhead, California. That's up in the mountains. And there was 8 or 9 or 10 of us. I forget now exactly, but
probably Wayne Aho, was he there?
Wayne Aho became one of my best friends. Yes.
Yeah. I knew him and Lee, fairly well. They had invited me out. I gave a talk one night in the Space Needle. They actually have a little area down there that holds meetings and stuff for about 100 people. I knew him fairly well. He was a very nice gentleman. Yeah.
Yes, he was indeed. He had he had on Mount Rainier. He had I can't remember it now. What was the name of that? He had about 5 acres dedicated to working with unusual people and unusual things. That's the first time I saw a car run on water, because one of the people who was there was running. This was back in the 70s, I think I was there. And people were running their cars on olive oil and stuff. It was different people from different walks of life that he accepted and said, yeah, let's foster this and get it out to the people. So anyway, we got back and got acquainted. And while we were up at the lake, all I did was I was fascinated with this guy Carr, because he was not talking human language. He was talking natural language, which is, you could say one word and you work from one principle to the other, because the basis of everything are principles. And if you understand principles, you can skip or jump from different ways that people, places, and things operate by dealing with the principle, because we're all one gigantic state of consciousness that goes on forever. And so we set up all night long and conversed on a level that was just extraordinary. And he told me about Tesla and his love for life, and he wanted to introduce the simplicities of life. And so did Carr. And he said, "Well, let's wait and see what happens." Well, it wasn't long. I think we were up there about a week or so, and just picking each other's brain. It was really wonderful. And I talked to the other physicists. We had a couple of physicists, and we had Aho, and we had Rapolti. Who else do we have? They were engineers, and a week or so later, they called us. Understanding Group called us and said, "We, strangely enough, were granted anonymously a giant." Well, you ever see one of these buildings that house blimps or dirigibles? A huge warehouse facility in Apple Valley, or Hesperia, actually, California. And they said it's fully stocked with everything, and you guys can come down and go to work. So I'm shortcutting things a little bit. Oh, there's 1 minute left. Okay, let's see.
Well, you'll be back on in just a little while there, but go ahead.
Okay,
so you made it down to Apple Valley, and you had a big hangar.
Yeah, we had a huge place, and we had the machine shop and tool and die. We had everything there, living quarters and offices, and so we all went to work. Everybody there loved what we were doing. That's the beautiful thing about working with nature. You love what you're doing. You're not doing it because you have to, and you're doing it because you want to. So we were working round the clock. We'd take cat naps during the night or during the day, whenever we felt like it. But we knew that if we can get some prototypes going, and then find a way to introduce them to people, they could not just have them in the physical dimension, but they can realize by their perception that the mind that operates these vehicles is the same mind that they have, that they very seldom use. And so the idea was to raise the consciousness of people in the way of perception, to realize that when you work from the inside, seeing and doing and being, you change the exterior world so fast that the brain cannot conceive of the swiftness that you've.
All right, let me interrupt you, Ralph. We have to go to our break here. We'll be right back with more on Exploring the Bizarre.
Exploring the Bizarre. Your e-ticket ride into the world of the paranormal. Strap yourself in as we traverse the universe, exploring the unexplained. UFOs, ghosts, lost worlds, cryptozoology, as well as other dimensions. It's time to take back the night. Now, your electrifying hosts of Exploring the Bizarre, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
All right, welcome back to Exploring the Bizarre tonight. We are talking with Ralph and Marcia Ring and Wilbur Allen, and we're going to bring Will back into the conversation. So, during the previous segment, Will, while you were talking about the green lights, green orbs, I think is what you were referring to them.
Yes. Yes.
And I suppose this is the $5 billion question. What are they?
Well,
yeah. Okay. Well, yeah. What are they?
well, let's just go back. Let's go back a little bit.
Right.
The U.S. government initially documented them in 1942 over Germany in the combat arena, where Air Force pilots were reporting balls of light following their aircraft. And initially, the Allies thought it was the Germans, and then the Germans thought it was the Allies. But in the reality, these anomalies that were monitoring these aircraft in combat were extraterrestrial anomalies. It just so happens, and we were talking about that before we went to break, that the green objects that I documented at the U.S. Capitol building and the flap that happened at the U.S. Capitol building 50 years earlier, July 16, 1952, the images that I took at the U.S. Capitol building in 2002 were July 16, 2002, exactly 50 years after the first documentation of the flyby of the UFOs over the Capitol Dome in 1952. There was footage taken of that event, which people kept saying to me was CGI. But when I did an analysis of that 16 millimeter Bolex footage, it indicated that the person that took the motion picture while the event was taking place was hand holding their motion picture camera, because the footage itself had XYZ deviations, meaning, you know, how when you put a camera on a tripod, your image becomes stabilized.
Right.
While if you're trying to hold your camera on your shoulder, like most cameramen did back in the day, like I did when I worked at ABC News,
Yep.
that image stabilization is impossible when you've got a 50-pound Betamax camera on top of your shoulder. And, you know, you've got wobbly conditions because you can't possibly keep yourself erect and stable for such a long period of time to maintain a stable shot. So the person that took the footage at the U.S. Capitol building July 16, 1952, did it just long enough to get the objects fly by, because understanding in 1952, the motion picture technology was 16 millimeter Bolex. A Bolex camera was like this big box that they used to make motion pictures back in the day. It was a 16 millimeter motion picture camera with spools on the top. And this guy had this Bolex on his shoulder and he filmed it. So I did a correctional analysis of the 16 millimeter film that he filmed, and it was 360 frames of motion picture showing the objects fly by the U.S. Capitol Dome. And in the 360 frames, 258 of those frames required corrections. Those corrections were associated to that person not being able to keep his camera stabilized on one fixed object. So taking the footage into 3D Max technology and using virtual technology, virtual camera technology, I was able to perform a visual stabilization of the footage just based on the technology that was available at hand. And I'm using 3D Max, which is Autodesk technology, to do the stabilization. And it proved without a doubt that the footage is authentic. It can't possibly be a CGI rendering, because a CGI rendering requires a fixed space. Anybody that does animation understands that when you animate something, that your background has to be stable. And that means in most cartoons, when you look at it, you see the backgrounds are stable and uniform as the action transpires. That's because it's created on a uniform platform. But to do a motion picture, which is not on a uniform platform, like on a tripod, and to handhold it requires a lot more skills. And the person that filmed it in the 1950s had enough skills to at least film the objects as they were flying by, regardless to the fact that he was not being stable with it. So the footage itself
do we know who took the picture?
No, none of that. All of the footage, in fact, somehow was in the British archives, and Nick Pope was the one that brought it to light. And that's so interesting, in fact, that, you know, all of the data that was available to the event that did transpire on the days that it did transpire, July 16, 1952 to July 26th, 1952, was a period of 10 days that the events were happening in the Washington, D.C. area. That it was indeed something that the government at the time went around and took all of the material from everybody that had a camera that was on the campus of the U.S. Capitol building. And tourists had flash cameras. People had cameras back in those days. They took the film on everybody's cameras. They removed all of the film that the government could get their hands on. They got it. But this one particular piece of footage just so happens to end up in the British Defense Archives. And now it's being released.
Well, and plus
I
should add also, there was no CGI in 1952.
Impossible, exactly.
Computer-generated images.
Data, it's so when you get a person saying CGI, and be careful, there's a lot of people who claim to be UFO experts, and the first thing out of their mouth is CGI. Now, and I taught CGI at a graduate level at a university in Washington, D.C. So when a person says to me, "Oh, it's CGI," blah blah, and they're going off with with the facts like, oh, it's a CGI rendering, then I asked them, what program was utilized to render that effect? And they can't answer me. That's because they don't know CGI. And to say something that you don't know, and which basically is called speaking out of your ass, and most people speak out of their ass when they say things relative to UFOs, that, you know, the damage associated to that misinformation does more damage than the actual truth. So I would rather sit there and give you something that's factual versus to sit there and tell you a lie. And to say something is CGI and not know what CGI technology rendered that would be telling you a lie. And I can't do that.
Now, the ruling, I think a lot of people, the ones that throw the skeptical stuff at you regarding that particular series of photographs, say that it's reflections from street lights in the area.
But wait a minute,
lights on the Capitol.
Just does not add up. Now, the guy's motion picture footage, when you start talking about reflections, and it's interesting because basically reflections are associated to the optics and the impurities associated to the optics. In the 1950s, they didn't have the crystal clear ED glass like Nikon and Zeitz Icon has right now. And when you start talking about optical distortions on a physical level, and there's a physics associated to reflections when you start taking pictures and you start getting reflections in your photographs, generally speaking, if you're using a lens that has an array of lenses associated to it, that the amount of lenses that's in that array, that just multiplies the amount of optical distortion that's going to be in your photograph if there's a light source, because the optics just is not generated to, per se, photograph bright light sources. So there's a problem with that. The guy's 16 millimeter motion picture film required up to 360 frames, 258 frames of correction. In that, when I noticed the objects that were in the sky that were being photographed, that were moving, and there were other objects above the clouds, which people never talked about, but there were other, much more objects that flew by the U.S. Capitol during that time, that in the correction element associated to it, when I started looking at the reflections associated to the streetlights, and then I started looking at the objects that were in the sky, that it was not consistent, because the objects in the sky are moving from the left of the frame to the right side of the frame from the perspective of the camera that took the motion picture footage in front of the reflection pool from where I'm gathering, looking at the footage as I analyzed it. So if that is indeed the case, then the lights that are on the ground would be permanent reflections no matter where I tilt my camera up and down if I'm filming from a perspective of the ground, because that's the physics associated to reflections of bright light sources and optics that are associated to the camera's technology that's being utilized today. It's impossible for lights that are in motion in the sky to be relative to lights on the ground.
And also too, if they were there one night, they would be there
every night.
Well, almost every night.
Wait a minute. Hold it. You're correct. Yes, they would have to be there every night because the lights are there. They're permanent fixtures, so no matter who took pictures there, you would still see the same reflections. You don't.
I would guess so. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so now, how did you? When did you take your car? I mean, you live in D.C. or nearby?
I lived 4 blocks from the White House, and I just so happened to have been freelancing that night, and Def Jam Records hired me to do an album cover for an artist. And the artist came to town, and we started taking pictures everywhere. We went to Haynes Point, which is a park in Southwest Washington. We went near the Capitol, the Washington Monument. At the end of the night, we ended up at the U.S. Capitol building reflection pool, and we're sitting there taking pictures of the artist, and his manager, who was with me, just blurts out the mouth. He says, "Hey, is that a UFO?" And I wasn't really listening to him, but he was like just saying weird stuff. "Hey, is that a UFO?" He had been drinking too, so I initially thought it was possibly the effects of some Cavassier. So, when you take a few shots of Cavassier, you'll say anything. And he took it, basically drank the whole bottle. So he was talking about UFOs, and I'm trying to focus on this artist. But as I'm focusing on the artist is sitting there, and he said something even more abstract to me, because he said he turned around in the reflection pool, and behind him, he said he saw what looked like a 6-foot-long amoeba. and it swam up behind him. And then as he looked at it, it swam back. And as I'm taking pictures, there's this anomaly in the reflection pool water, and it's submerged. And there's another anomaly on the shore of the reflection pool. There's another anomaly that's on the house side of the roof of the Capitol building. And then there's a bigger one above the dome. And one of them entered the water of the reflection pool and swam.
Now, are we talking about rods?
No, we're talking about energy-based life form.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know like what Jose Escamilla, my friend Jose, was filming these.
Yeah.
No. These are not rods. What I photographed was with a 35 millimeter camera. And what entered the reflection pool initially, it would be what would one consider a orb, a spiritual orb, a sphere of sorts. It was like this translucent ball of light that looked like a feathery translucency associated to it. And I have been in multiple positions at the U.S. Capitol building, several of them. The larger ones, however, were on the roof of the Capitol building, and there was a much larger one above the dome. But the one that was on the ground in the rear of the reflection pool entered into the reflection pool and swam. And as it swam, I was photographing it, not necessarily photographing it per se as I focused on the artist. I wasn't thinking about the objects in the background, but it just so happened to be photographed on film. So I did an analysis of it as it was essentially, I'd say maybe 25 feet from his position as he was sitting. And the water of the reflection pool was clear like a magnifying glass, and it magnified this thing, and it looked like an amoeba. It has a sphere at the top, a blob, a ball. It's perfectly round, and it had this plasma-like fluid, which I could only describe as a fluid because it didn't look like anything I'd ever seen before, but it could possibly have the same overall physical definitions as an amoeba, a one-celled organism, because it was just this jellyfish-like thing.
Wilbur, would you say that this is a living thing?
NASA confirmed the validity of non-corporeal extraterrestrials. Non-corporeal meaning a life form without a physical body, an energy-based life form. And what I documented at the U.S. Capitol building, what came out of the green spheres that landed were these blobs of light. Blobs. That's all I could describe them as. I've never seen anything like that. And it just so happens that on some of the lunar surface photographs from the Apollo moon missions, that these anomalous blobs of light just happen to be on the lunar surface.
Well, these amoebas sound an awful lot like, though, the photographs that Trevor James Constable took. You know, he called them critters.
Yeah, critters, or whatever you want to call them. They came out of the green spheres that landed, and we're talking about green spheres that the U.S. government knew about in 1942. Green spheres. They had a report associated to the green spheres, and they're at the U.S. Capitol building in 2002 landing, and there were thousands of them. The ones that were in the air that are photographed were maybe the size of bowling balls, but the ones that were on the ground in the reflection pool itself were the size of garden peas, thousands of them.
Now, did they come out of the green spheres, or are they the green spheres?
They dripped. They were dripped from the green spheres. They were dripping in the air. They were like just dripping them out, dripping. And it just so happened to generate a stargate as it vanished. And I documented that.
So we're talking about basically an energy-based life form.
Energy-based life forms, yes.
Of course, we're all, energy.
People talk about the small spheres. You've heard people talk about small spheres the size of golf balls and oranges fly by. What do you think is piloting those things? What possibly could be inside that ball, making that ball move intelligently? What type of life form would fit inside a ball? What could you compress into a small area? Energy.
Yeah, well,
do they have to be in the
Tesla
ball?
was talking about that. We're talking about Tesla technology at an extraterrestrial level. Tesla technology. Well, alien technology that Tesla just happened to reinvent.
But I mean, saying though that they are, that they're a craft. I mean, that's kind of a materialistic way of looking at it, though, because the way I'm thinking about these things is that they are the craft. The
The
craft.
craft consists of energy, but the energy itself has to have a form of intelligence associated to it. Energy is not intelligent. Energy is something else. Intelligence is something else. You put intelligence with energy, what do you have? Controlled energy. You could think your craft to go any direction, at any time, at any velocity, instantaneously. That's what the U.S. military doesn't seem to understand. You can't send an aircraft up against a device that can fly multiple directions instantaneously.
Mm-hmm.
Impossible. What are you locking onto? Nothing.
I've seen footage of UFOs where they fly around almost like insects.
Yes,
Rather than and I always they give me the impression rather than being say like a nuts and bolt craft with somebody inside pushing buttons and stuff that you're looking at something that's alive because their movements suggest something living.
It's a life form inside energy. It's a life form inside energy. The energy has to have a form of thought. Now, what do you know that it has energy that can think? I mean, logically speaking, only man would logically be that type of computer that could form a thought from the energy from within us. But when you start looking at an object like a ball, and a ball that seems to have a form of intelligence associated to it, the ball has a physical structure, and within the physical structure itself is space, and inside that space, a life form, an entity of some sort would have to occupy and manipulate that ball on the outside to make it do whatever it's doing that we're seeing on camera. That space within that object would have to be the area in which whatever life form is maintaining that space, and he's flying the craft at its level, and I'm telling you what I documented at the U.S. Capitol building. We're like spirits. A spirit could do that.
Well, now, are these spirits or entities or whatever they are? Do you think that they are aware that they are at the Capitol building? I mean, do they have a purpose in being there?
Well, the fact that I documented it, and the last photograph of the evening that I took at the U.S. Capitol building, where I documented the formation of green spheres, there were these two blobs of light in the photograph, and one of them at the top just so happened to have the same shape as the blob of light that was documented at the rear of the reflection pool. So it indicated to me that what was at the rear of the reflection pool that swam up behind the guy that I was taking pictures of also confronted me at the last point of the evening when I took the picture of the green spheres as they warped out, which was even more abstract because I swear I saw Mayans in Mayan attire walking around as if they were like completely lost. It was a group of Mayans. They were completely dazed and confused, just walking around. Mayans. So that's what I saw.
We've got a couple of different things going on here. I mean, intelligence, yes, but possibly time travelers?
Well, the disappearance of the Mayan civilization, that the fact that in most of the Mexican documentation of UFOs are these spheres, and it just so happens that on several occasions, green spheres were documented in Peru. So one green sphere crashed, in fact, in, I believe, 2007 in a village in Peru in which the U.S. government had to quarantine the entire village and take whatever remnants of the craft that crashed there, which the villagers said was a green ball of light. And it just so happens that as soon as the object crashed and created this scoop in a mountain, which looks like they took, how ice cream looks and you use an ice cream scoop and you take a nice linear scoop out. It looked like something did a nice linear scoop on the side of a mountain where this thing crashed. And they took the residents or the people, the villagers of that little village, quarantined them, and they made that village no longer accessible to anyone in Peru. So now, whatever it is, the aliens are controlling it. Yes, U.S. government.
This has been going on forever.
I'm looking at several events which are not really that well documented, but there were several which involved green streaks of light that were documented one was by a UPI photographer, another one was by a photographer in Lima, Peru. And the green streaks were consistent with the green spheres that I documented at the U.S. Capitol building, which were consistent with the green spheres that followed the command module during Apollo 11 to the moon, which Buzz Aldrin documented. And they documented the green objects. So we have the documentation of them.
Did I hear something about a UFO, these being seen inside the Capitol building in the basement or something?
There was a rumor that at one point extraterrestrial bodies were stored in the basement of the U.S. Capitol building because it was a secure region. It's built like a fortress. But with all of the UFO activity that's going on around there and all of the activity that I documented 4 blocks from the White House, it to me indicated there's a much broader level of interest from the extraterrestrial standpoint of things in Washington, D.C. that the ET are interested in. I was getting stuff 4 blocks from the White House that was materializing in the airspace. And on the nights that I would get this documentation that these objects materialized on video, residents in Northeast DC, which was the trajectory of the objects that I would document, were disappearing mysteriously. And several people, and it just happens to be ironic that on the nights I documented things, people vanished. So if people are disappearing when these objects are materializing, and
all right, we're going to have to hold you. We're going to have to hold you at that thought, Will, because we have to go to our bottom of the hour break. So we'll be back in just a few minutes for more Exploring the Bizarre.
Now back to Exploring the Bizarre with 2 of the most electrifying researchers in the paranormal. Your hosts, Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz.
All right, welcome back to the final segment of Exploring the Bizarre. Time just goes by so fast on our program when we have such great guests. So, Ralph, now the previous segment, you were talking about how Otis T. Carr, yourself, and other engineers were set up by some benefactor in a hangar there in California, and I guess that you all had some pretty interesting developments and successes within that facility, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened? And why more people don't know about this?
Well, I think more people are interested in the creature comforts and the new car every 3rd year and the stuff in material life. They're more interested in that. This deals with, and ever since I met Carr, a spiritual life, because we are energy beings. We are not human beings at all, but we think we are, so we keep creating the idea of being human. Mm-hmm. And everything we look at or touch or see or think is our own creation. Reality comes in when you feel your way through as an energy being, and you can look at a book and concentrate on it. I can't do this yet, but I know people that do, and they can just concentrate on the book and then and tell you to turn the page to 343 on the 3rd paragraph, and they can quote it verbatim. I mean, it's amazing what you can do with your energy field because it's unlimited. We're very limited in our human type form, and that's okay because a human life is meant to be experienced, and it's very, very wonderful and beautiful to some, and some not. But what Carr, what Tesla, and what I was engaged with was basically the invisible life that we are, that who we really are is invisible. We are pure energy, and we create a physical reality. So long story short, because I see we're running out of time, we decided to build physical craft that people could see and touch and do whatever they wanted to. So that, and then lead them to the fact that they can be operated by their feelings, by their thought waves sent from feelings. You have to operate from your heart to your brain with a communication that doesn't break on one side or the other, and you can move energy, as Will was mentioning a little while ago, anywhere instantly, because we are energy, not a duality anymore. We are the energy moving, the motion moving through time and space, but we just don't realize it. So when I met Marcia Brown, she was engaged in this kind of stuff, and she was working for Jet Propulsion Lab, working with the Jet JLP, and then she had Bendix Engineering, deep space tracking. And when we met, we started talking the same thing. We got to wake the people up. They're all asleep. They don't realize, but they're having fun. Well, then leave them alone. They don't have to go anywhere or do anything. Just stay in the Maseratis, and we'll show them spaceships. And so that's how I met Marcia. And can you say a couple words, Marcia?
Well, it's been an interesting, very interesting journey through this life experience. And it has been kind of depressive because people don't seem to want to wake up. We've all been programmed so many eons.
Take that word depressive, deep rest.
Okay.
See, people are asleep in a deep rest, but they will wake up someday. So depression seems to be a negative connotation, but deep rest sounds, wow, that's great, I'll wake up.
And I do believe that, Ralph. I do believe that everyone will eventually wake up, and they will see the craft that are already out in the field right now.
Yeah, they're all over the place.
Marcia, let me ask you now. When you worked for places like JPL, I mean, do you think that, or maybe even know that there may have been other, scientists and engineers who also held the same kind of beliefs that you and Ralph do, but just due to the situation where if you talk about that kind of stuff, you can find yourself blacklisted and your career ruined. I mean, do you think there are other scientists, physicists out there who are entertaining the same ideas that you two are?
I definitely do, Tim. When I did work for Bendix Field Deep Space Tracking Station and went to JPL, they were actually looking for the ways to communicate with the beings in the outer space. They actually said that, and this was probably in the early 1970s, I think. Yeah. Anyway, it was amazing to me. But yes, I really do believe there's many people in the scientific field, and I don't. Well, one of the things that happened to me when at Bendix, I was in the supervisory monthly or weekly meetings, and one of the engineers told us that there was a sighting of both blue and red light going and coming from the same space. In the field, and nothing more was said. We talked about it at that one meeting, and then about 2 weeks later, nothing was said. So I saw that engineer that reported that at the meeting in the hallway, and I said, "What became of that?" And he said, "I don't know what you're talking about, Marcia." He was totally quieted. It was totally, totally downplayed. Yeah. And so, yes, I do believe there were many people in the Bendix Deep Space Tracking Station that I worked with that knew that there was energy and that there were entities already, aliens about us. Yeah, I'm sure there are. And I'm sure there are many now that are kind of afraid to lose their jobs. You hear about the
they're waiting in the wings. We have pods all over the world. We have scientists. We have people from all walks of life, and they are in the same agreement that Marcia and I are, that this is nothing. This is a synthetic life that we're creating to experience, and there's nothing wrong with that at all, because there's a lot here to experience. But they have in their deeper thoughts or their meditation, realizing that, you know, there's so much more that we're not using that would make everybody happy, not just a few. And but they are quietly behind the scenes, waiting in the wings to do what they do, which is produce these devices on different levels to make life easier for everybody. But we have the we have the Secret Service. We have the thought police watching every move that we make in all of the pods, and we can go up to a line and talk about it and demonstrate to a small degree what we're doing. But the minute we try to step over that line, they'll shut us down. They wipe out the whole lab and take the people.
All right. Well, okay. Well, talking about demonstrating, I mean, you actually your company actually created a prototype of the OTC device that I think I remember you reading that it actually did work, and you were able to operate it, albeit briefly.
Yes, we had several devices. There wasn't just the one. We had two larger ones on the 45-foot scale level, but the other smaller ones, which was anywhere from 12 inches to 3 feet to whatever, we were exercising them around Apple Valley, Hesperia area. And we've got documents that people have, you know, saw what we were doing, but we didn't need the looky-loos to come and see us. And one of these characters was James Gilliland, whose observance of the UFOs and everything are well known, and he's up in Washington State. Mm-hmm. He used to see us operating these craft, and his mother forbid him and kept him away. They said don't go over there. So, but anyway, there's many craft that are in full operation now, but you have to use your imaging, which is everything. Everything we see has been imaged, which is your imagination in full operation. In order.
Well, I'm sorry. Just what was the time frame? What was the dates that this was going on with you and these prototypes?
Well, it's 59 and 60.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry. Excuse me for interrupting your chain of thought there.
Well, that's okay. I know you want to get this in before the show ends, so I'll jump to the actual the actual operation of the craft that I was involved with. And that was a 45-foot craft. We had proven the prototypes on many levels. And Wayne Aho, who was our PR man at the time, called General Motors and said, "We have some ideas we'd like to talk to you about, and in motivation and things. And can we meet?" And they said, "Yeah, we'll send somebody out." So we met a rep and we engaged with what we had. We had a small 12-inch model in a suitcase actually a valise, and we were saying we'd like to take the car that's spinning their wheels vertically and take that wheel and put it horizontally and lift it off the earth and stop putting down cement over gardens and killing animals over large terrains and get it in the air. They said, "Are you guys crazy?" That was their statement. And we went on to explain it to them that the energy fields that we were working with was all magnetic in nature, not electromagnetic, but pure magnetism. There's a big difference. Mm-hmm. And so about that time, Carr popped open the valise and the little craft came out and moved around the room and everything. And they were wondering, well, they must have some kind of remotes. Now, this is in the 50s, so we didn't have remotes and buttons. But he said, "Would you guys taking your jackets off and let us scan you and so we did. And they said, well, there's nothing here that they have. Well, how are you operating it? Well, now I have to say this first, because what I'm going to say next is going to be a little borderline doubtful by people. But but the University of Minnesota in the science department has, and you can document this by looking it up on YouTube. What was the name of that now? Energy. Oh my God. I can't. They've got a program on, and they use the gymnasium there at the university. And I can't remember oh God. It'll come to me maybe, but in the gymnasium, they had small craft that they had diodes on a guy's skull cap, and he was operating everything with his mind.
Okay.
No, there's no problem. That's a wireless communication between you and the object or whatever it was, and they were getting away with it because they said this is for people that are paraplegic or quadriplegic. I can't pronounce my words, and we can have them use their mind to, I'm hungry and can you bring me some food or water or something. So so they're still being funded now on the premise that someday we're going to get things off the ground with just using our minds. Well, anyway, where were we? So when we were asked, how do you operate these things? We told them we're just using our minds. We're focusing on a different level. We're not using thought at all. We're using feelings from our internal organs, if you will, our heart and our brain, to synchronize between us and the craft. And when we told him that it is just as much alive as you are, that did it. He just he wasn't his patience was waning. And we told him that you couldn't have an accident in the craft. And he said, well, there goes your insurance companies and everything. They don't want that. So and it flew around, and they could look in through we had Lexan to the top of the model that we showed them, and they could look into the pilot compartment. And he said, well, where's your ignition? Where's your steering wheel? These are the words they used. And I said, we don't need them. In reality, in an authentic reality, you need nothing but your mind to do everything unlimitedly. Where we think we are, we can do hardly anything that isn't already limited. And we either throw it away and say, well, I guess that's never going to happen and stuff. And it won't until they start feeling their way through life, which is quite different than thinking our way. So, anyway, Carr said, well, they're not going to buy this. And when we left, they said, Carr, you put them up, we're going to shoot you down. We can't have this. We have hundreds of thousands of people on the payroll. And you're telling us, and Carr did say at that point, don't you realize that if you give people the opportunity to do what they envisioned or they imagined they could do, to be a creative being and create magnificent things the world has never seen yet, but they're restricted because they have to go to work and they have to come home and go to bed so they can get up and go to work, and it goes on like a squirrel cage over and over and over all the time. And he says, well, that's the system we live in. Where are you guys from? And he said, no, you get out of here and forget General Motors is doing anything along those lines.
You would have enjoyed reading an article that appears in this month's edition of the 14 Times about Gabriel Green, who lived down there in Yucca Valley, California, Joshua Tree. He had a plan for a moneyless system that he claimed that was given to him by the Space Brothers or something along that line. And it's very intriguing. You know, Gabe ran for president in 1964. It was Gabe in 1864 and Gabriel Green the decades later. So we have had a UFO presidential candidate, but of course he's passed away now. But he has some intriguing information, and indeed.
Well, a lot of my friends in those days were the people that traveled with us around in tents, trying to get the idea across to people. With Gabriel Green and Van Tassel and George Hunt Williamson. They were we were all in the same mindset, so it was beautiful. We could, and those green pods that you saw, somebody Will saw them, were common around every time we set up a tent to talk. They'd be all over the place in the
green orbs.
The green orbs, yeah. And but Carr said, "Well, let's go." And he said, "It's too bad because this has been trying to happen for years, and it's okay. People don't want it yet. It's okay, but they've dug themselves into a deep hole, and they're threatened by annihilation or extinction." Extinction.
Well, now, any chance that any of this will ever be revealed or made available to the public, or is it a lost cause? Are you still working on any of these devices?
We have hundreds of pods around the world, and this can be, you can communicate with the pod yourself on Blue Star Enterprise. That's our website, and you can get in touch with many people that are working on things now, very close to what we were doing in Apple Valley in the late 50s. So
that's a great thing to know. You should have yourself maybe a mini convention of some time and get all these people together and put some of these devices on display.
Well, that's the funny thing. You should mention that, but that's where we differ in how we get things done naturally. We wait for nature to invite us, or we wait for the people when they're ready to, let's see what you got, then we come into the picture. Otherwise, we just stay quiet and let people experience anything they want, working their way up to a collective consciousness that has no limitations.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, if you try to force the issue, you'll just be hitting a brick wall every time.
Yeah,
that's right.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I would have hoped that some of this information and devices would be made accessible to the world in my lifetime, but I can see some of it has been questionable. There's no doubt about it. I mean, some of the theories are kind of far-fetched there by all means, but it's like nobody is even willing to take a look at them. I mean, there's no peer study. There's no communication with the academic community or anything. Well, I think Tim, is it approaching the midnight hour here?
Yeah. It's getting close to the end of the program, so I think that why don't we let our guests, let our audience know a little bit more where they can find out about them on the web. So Ralph and Marcia, what's your website, and I guess that you've got is a convention coming up later this month?
Yes, we do. It's going to be on Mount Shasta. It's called the Mount Shasta Summer Conference, and we have one of the interesting people there is a lady from Venus that is blowing people away by what she knows and talks about. But we're scheduled, both Marcia and I are scheduled to talk. That's on the what is it? The July 27th to the 29th, 27th, 28th, and 29th at Mount Shasta. And so if anybody's interested, they can look. They can find that blob on our website, and our website is Blue Star Enterprise, all one word, .com, and they can go on there and they can locate on their pilots that are flying their planes with just their mind. They're not using control.
Wow, wonderful.
And you'll find all kinds of things on Blue Star that will pique your imagination and show you the difference between feeling your way and thinking your way through life. It's quite a contrast.
All right, and Wilbur, what about you? You got a website?
I've got UFODC.com, or people can Google Wilbur Allen YouTube channel, or Wilbur Allen National Geographic, and they can get access to all of my photographic and video work.
Well, also too, we have our YouTube version of the show, Mr. UFO Secret Files, and if you have no objections, we'll take some of the stills and material and add that to the audio here, and everybody will have 2 hours of digging into the information even more. We're on Stitcher, we're on iTunes and Google something or other. My goodness. And of course on KCORradio.com. Thank you, Tina. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, my guest this evening. Wonderful show. And let the information keep it coming.
One last word. If people are interested, all they have to do is type in my name, Ralph Ring, on YouTube, and there'll be scores of things that are talking about what I didn't really have a chance to finish tonight.
Well, we'll get you back on, and that's got a good ring to it. That's all I can
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
You bet.
Okay, you guys.
Good night.
Thanks.
All right, good night.
You've been listening to Exploring the Bizarre with hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz. They're taking back the night by jetting non-stop across the cosmos in search of the truly bizarre and totally unexplained, with you as their co-pilot. Thursday nights at 7 p.m. Pacific, 10 p.m. Eastern, on the KCOR Digital Radio Network. For more information on Exploring the Bizarre and hosts Timothy Beckley and Tim Swartz, check out their KCOR Digital Radio Network page. Follow their YouTube channel at MRUFO 1100. Exploring the Bizarre.